Welcome to the Elaborate Podcast. Joining me now, of course, is Mary. How are you doing?
Very well, thank you.
And this is me, Indy. So thank you for tuning in to another episode. Today we're going to be talking about public figures and their public statements. Sometimes their public statements can be at odds with who they are as a persona, as an icon in popular culture, or how we view them as fans of theirs. And we'll be looking at Mo Salah, Ingmar Bergman, a little bit of Morrissey, Jermaine Greer, also as well as people such as David Lynch. So joining me for this part, but not for the rest of the podcast,
Oh,
you're in Switzerland.
I was, yes.
So you have a new nephew.
I do.
Yeah.
Yay.
So congratulations.
Thank you.
All happy, bouncing baby, you know?
Very happy.
Yeah.
Sleeping, eating.
Okay, that kind of rich in detail
Yeah.
is what we're going to miss in part two of this show. So for part two and part three, it's just going to be me, but filling her regular schedule and position in the podcast hot seat. Mary will be back for next week's episode. So join me in part two. Welcome to part two, and as you heard the intro, Mary was there, but at the time of recording, she wasn't, so that's why you're with me. But it's a beautiful summer's day. June is in full swing, and it's absolutely gorgeous. It's amazing. It reminds me very much of Laurie Lee, and I know I've mentioned this before in previous podcasts, but he really had his finger on the pulse of nature and how it affects our mood and how we react to it, and this first stirrings of spring, how it first comes, a first ray of sunshine, and you're not quite ready for it mentally, but then the switch changes and you're kind of plugged in and you're there. And that's kind of what's happening now with summer as well. Like it took us so long to get here, now it's here. Everything feels so natural and warm, and it's amazing, it's wonderful. And obviously, it being the summer, things are coming to a close in terms of teaching. So as an ESL teacher, things generally wind up around June, or wind down I should say, while in July of course it can continue with summer camps and students that want to do or continue their course into the summer and make it last just a month longer, while August is definitely the period where everything is finished until September picks it up again. And it's a funny thing. I got a bottle of wine from one of my groups, one of my classes. You can hear my paper fluttering in the background there, and it was a really nice gesture. As kind of you could kind of guess from the story that was in the previous podcast, the Storytime edition. Kind of the measure of time. I guess maybe everybody has their own measure of time, but for me at least, it's like, it's like, okay, 10 days since the earthquake, or 14 days, or 2 months since the hurricane. In terms of like, I just feel this weight lifting off me now. It's like we're on the other side. We made it to the end of another year, because there's a lot of responsibility, or I feel like a lot of responsibility when you have different groups of fully formed people, kind of depending on your preparation and your work in the class, and you're basically leading them. And of course they contribute a lot, and it's very much a partnership as well. It has lots of elements of that, but also you do feel like a great sense of responsibility. And you make it to the end of 1 week, to the end of 1 month, you're like, okay, everything is ticking along nicely here. I haven't effed up in any way, so that's good. And now I can say that about the whole year, that I've made it to the end of the year, and it's a great feeling of relief. In some ways it's a very, I guess, not a helpful way of looking at the world, but it does at the very least keep me on the top of my game. So because I'm so worried about making a mistake that it kind of like, okay, I'll keep my focus. Let's not let things go wrong, and keep the classes on the right track, and make sure everybody's learning. So that's kind of what my mind has been thinking about recently as well. Another weird thing is as well, like, I have a great relationship with my students. I'm very fortunate with that, but sometimes it happens that they kind of like last day of class, they're like, okay, you speak Spanish now. profe, teacher, indie. You gotta speak Spanish now. Now, I've been here for a few years and my Spanish is good. Now, whenever I've spoken Spanish on the podcast, it has sounded terrible. Like, my accent when I speak Spanish on the podcast is pretty bad, but that's because I'm not really trying to speak it properly. But like, I have, notaries, like, fixing bloody leaks and, everything from like, hey, where are the apples in the supermarket to like complicated legal things in terms of, well, makes it sound like I've a criminal past. No, but in terms of like, for example, I'm trying to buy a house, so kind of legal things in terms of checking out classification of houses or what I'm entitled to as a foreigner, and kind of tax situations, for example, that kind of stuff. I'm having negotiations and discussions in Spanish about those things, and I feel quite comfortable. I don't really watch Spanish TV a lot, but because of the World Cup, I have been watching the 8 p.m. games in Spanish, and it's been very easy for me to understand as well. So like, I am good at Spanish, but it's like students don't really, I guess there's a perception that like Yuris or foreigners don't speak Spanish. So it's like, we'll catch you out now. We'll see if you are contributing or participating in society. And I do get that, because if like there was somebody in the country who was like here for 7 years and couldn't speak a word of Spanish and expected everybody to speak English, like, that is annoying, because like it's very rude, and you have to play your parts and make an effort to fit in, because like you're in their culture, I'm in the Spanish culture, so you have to make an effort to learn Spanish and to adapt and to try and blend in. So I think that is very fundamentally important. In fact, there are two adverts on TV which kind of play around this idea as well. One is like of a German tourist, I think, or something. He's like, "Hola, yeah, estoy contento." That's an English accent. I don't know why, but that's So like, this is a very popular image, I think, in Spanish people's minds about the foreigner who comes over and couldn't be bothered learning the lingo. And so it also is like, there's a feeling like it's like it's been like a scam or something. It's just like, you better speak English all year. No, we're getting our own back. It's like, yeah, but we've been speaking English because I'm your English teacher. We've been in English class. So it's kind of like, you feel like you have to put on a show or something. You have to prove something, and it's not really a natural conversation. And when it's not a natural conversation, I think most people feel it inhibits it. And that's definitely how I feel in these situations, and it doesn't really help. And then when you try and enter the conversation and say something, like, sometimes they don't even let you into the conversation and they ignore you. So, I'm not really sure what the point of this story is, but I guess if you have ever wondered what it's like to learn another language and to live in that country, this is just one reality that you have to face. It's not necessarily negative or positive. It's just something that is curious and can happen. I've seen happen quite a few times, but if you are making an honest effort to learn the language and you feel like you're making progress and you're doing your best, then you don't have to answer to anybody, and you don't have to feel shame, and just enjoy learning it, really, because that's the whole point, to have a passion for it and to do your best. I mentioned in a previous podcast as well, when I was talking about doing like the voiceovers for an advert for an alcohol brand. How sometimes you can feel inhibited in certain situations where you could talk about quite complex things in a second language, but then if the person in front of you isn't really instilling you with confidence, or it's kind of provoking an insecurity in you, you like asking for a Coca-Cola in a bar could be more problematic than discussing the ins and outs of a political thing. But just because of how you're feeling. So it's, other people probably have a more natural ability for languages. I think I'm decent. I think I picked up Spanish, easily enough, because I've never actually like hit the books as such. Like, I've learned verbs and things like that, but I've just really been into just going out and practicing speaking and things like that, and listening to podcasts in Spanish and stuff like that. So, but maybe for a lot of people, they can switch naturally. I've heard stories of people switching to a second language and not even knowing that they've switched into another language because they're so comfortable, they haven't noticed that switch. I don't think I'll ever get there. I don't think I'll ever like start speaking Spanish and not really realize I'm speaking Spanish. But so people are comfortable to different extents in a second language, and they can wear it as a second skin. For me, it's always going to be like more of an effort, I think, in speaking it, even though I do speak it well. And that's just a reality for me. That's okay. I can live with that. So that's just one rumination of of speaking a second language. It wasn't really the intention of the podcast, but I started talking about it anyway. This week, there's this guy in America, Jamie Dupree, US journalist, who lost his voice because of something called tongue protrusion dystonia, which means that his tongue inhibits him from speaking more than 2 or 3 words. But because of artificial intelligence, neural networking, this Scottish company called Cereproc, if that is the name of it, if I pronounce it properly, have been able to replicate his voice or use technology to anticipate what he's going to say. It's a very sophisticated thing, basically. So he had to read a script, then they cut up all the words. They construct the phonetics. You can tell by my tone of voice, I'm in uncertain territory here, and I'm kind of not really sure how it works. But so what they say is like they slice up each word until the technology understands how basic phonetics works, and then they reorder the sequences of those words depending on what the person wants to say. So on the 25th of June, which was Monday past, this guy who's been working with a Scottish company got his voice back, and he has his own radio show, or 6 radio shows, and it's pretty nice. It's a good news story, I think. Also, the last podcast was the Summer Sun story, but the last podcast with Mary, and we were actually talking about things. It's the origin of music, basically, because we went to that exhibition in the Lancashire Forum. I've been doing that with a student of mine as well, because it was International Music Day, as discussed in that podcast. And basically, there's a really cool article I found on the internet. Basically, they talk about like the concept of intentionality. So they speculate by saying that music probably started with clapping and chanting and these kind of basic rhythms, but there was a point where there's intentionality, where people designed music on purpose, that they wanted to create something cultural or some kind of expression of an emotion, that would betray or express something of the interior world. Now, I've heard on other podcasts that one spur of this could have been the invention of fire, because it kind of allowed the brain to gaze inward, perhaps for the first time in our species, because before that we're just focused maybe on hunting and gathering. But then when we had fire and those kind of things, we could just sit down, gaze into the fire, which has a hold over us as a species, even today. And that allowed for more complex and abstract thoughts to gather, and that led to maybe artwork and, of course, music as well. They talk about 2 flutes. The first one, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing it properly, but it's the Divje Babe flute, which was discovered in Slovenia. Now, what's interesting about this is that it's a Neanderthal flute. Basically, people thought for a long time that Neanderthals were too stupid to create music, but now the consensus is that actually this was an example of Neanderthal craftsmanship, and that they were capable of expressing themselves artistically as well. Another one was found in Germany, called the Hohlefels flute, because that's the name of the cave where they found it. And again, apologies if I'm mispronouncing that to any German listeners. And it's a bit more sophisticated, I guess. You can find examples of both these flutes on YouTube, and I highly recommend that you YouTube them and that you listen to the music, because it's very eerie. It's like it's music, Jim, but not as we know it. So it's a bizarre feeling, because it's very lonely sound. It's a sound of I don't know. It's definitely mystical in a sense, otherworldly. And now that could be in 2 senses, because it is another world in terms of how far our species has come. But I don't know if the music was about another world for them, some kind of afterlife or heavenly sphere. But yeah, so there are 2 interesting examples of musical instruments. Now, there's one thing in particular that really caught my attention, because like in the previous podcast about the ancient instruments, I did discuss with Mary about how we saw the map and how they showed musical instruments spreading across the world. Now, my idea was that it kind of happened as a consequence of the traveling, in terms of, well, humans bring their things with them. They bring their food, they bring their animals, they bring their ideas, they bring their knowledge, and they bring their musical instruments if they have them. But in this article, they kind of say that music was a very important part of social bonding. And there's a book about this. It's about collective joy. I think we've mentioned this before as well, where like parties and drinking and music was a great social glue ever since ancient times and in its modern incarnation of like big rock stadium tours and all that. And they kind of say like that. This like in Homo sapiens, this idea of music had or music had more of a of a widespread or profound impact, and that gave us an edge over Neanderthals because maybe it helped our brains develop more because we were kind of messing around with chords, and also we had more social glue, and that made our species thrive and succeed in a more important way. But they are also making the point that in the article that perhaps because of that social cohesion, that actually made it easier for us to move around because we had each other's back. We moved as a unit, better protection, and maybe more open to speaking to other human tribes, for example. So, like a lot of things, it's very difficult to know, uh, definitively what the real scenario was. Maybe it's a combination of all of them. So I don't know. So that's just a little bit of the summer feeling, the end of the ESL course, and picking up a little bit from the music focused podcast of 2 episodes ago. So I'll leave you with a little bit of music. This is still part 2, and we'll pick up again in just a few moments with some more political ideas and discussion. Okay, I hope you enjoyed that little piece of music. So different political things happening, and I want to talk about a few of them. David Lynch, of course, you probably have all seen this, where he was talking about how Trump could go down as a genius, and he's come out since and kind of, um, I guess, clear it up or clear up the confusion generated by his comments. Now you can accept that if you want. I didn't really feel that his clarifications really changed the effect of his initial comments. Because another thing he said as well was that there was no intellectual rebuttal for Trump. That there hasn't been a really good intellectual response or challenge to Trump, and I would wholeheartedly disagree with that for a variety of reasons, which I will set forth now. I think there's been a lot of wonderful people, and you can choose journalists, broadcasters like Stephen Colbert or Trevor Noah, newspapers like this, New York Times, CNN. A lot of people have been able to challenge very effectively the things that he's been doing, but the problem is that there are a lot of people that just don't really want to see it or accept it, and there's so many blatant examples of this as well. A case in point would be a recent rally that he had, where he was talking about how he hates the elites, and everybody hates the elites, and his voters hate the elites. That's obvious because that's why they voted for Trump. They wanted to break and rupture the kind of traditional system of career politicians and people that didn't care about ordinary people. That's obviously very, very clear. But then within the space of perhaps even a minute, he goes on to say how he has the most amazing apartment, and people start cheering at that as well. And it's so obviously a clear contradiction. Like, on one hand, boo to the elites, but look at me, how rich and successful I am, And so, like, any rational observer or any journalist worth their salt would be able to identify that, explain that, and rip Trump apart because of that. Because again, as I said, it's such an obvious contradiction. But the people that are in that audience, they have this kind of mystical appreciation for Trump, and I don't mean that in a very condescending way, because I think a lot of people's relationship with politics is kind of half formed or mystical, and that's even before this current wave of identity, of Trump and Brexit and all these cult of personality leaders and platforms built on issues such as identity and immigration. I think it's been a long-standing reality in politics because for a lot of reasons and for a lot of years, people just didn't have the time to invest so much time into politics because you had families and jobs, and your family voted Republican or Democrat, so you did as well, and becomes like a sport. It's like a team that you follow. That no matter what they do, you're generally on their side. Um, like, so even though you have that situation where Trump is like so obviously part of the elite and obnoxiously part of the elite, and doesn't really hide that. You have this cognitive dissonance where people hate the elites but support him because of their mystical, unquestioning support of him, which I think is very common and a very common fault in politics in general in many countries. And the perverse thing now is that, like, because he's getting so much criticism, which is justified psychologically for a lot of supporters, they think that it's unjustified, and that deepens, they double down on their support for him. So there are a lot of factors there that I think a political theorist or philosopher will be able to expand on in even more detail. But like the issue isn't the intellectual rebuttal; it's just the very obvious refusal or inability of people to accept what's right in front of them, i.e., the facts and the reality. I mean, another case in point would be Trump going to North Korea, because again, I mean, even if he had managed to pull an amazing deal off, I don't think it would have really said much about him as a leader, because he hasn't really closed any deals. The self-styled deal maker hasn't closed any deals really in his term in office thus far, and apart from his questionable politics from my perspective and a lot of people's perspectives, he's not actually very competent in getting the things done as regards his platform and the things that he wants to achieve in his presidency. So even if he had achieved this wonderful agreement with North Korea, it would have had the impression of just happening out of nowhere, because suddenly North Korea wanted negotiations. It wasn't because of skilled diplomacy from the States. And if they had signed this glorious agreements, it's like 1,000 monkeys and 1,000 typewriters working for 1,000 years. At least one of them would have produced something close to Shakespeare. It would just be one of those historical curiosities that it would have happened out of nothing. Now, there's two things to add to that. One is that if someone is a Trump supporter listening to this and go, well, that's just typical left-wing politics, cannot praise Trump for doing something good. It's like, I would say no, because I mean, when he when he greeted those prisoners that were released by North Korea, those 3 Americans, I mean, that was a good thing, and he got a lot of praise for that. I think a lot of left commentators wouldn't begrudge giving a compliment if it were due. And secondly, as well, again, if he had come away with an amazing deal, it wouldn't excuse what happened in Iran, because he dismantled a perfectly functioning framework there. So on one hand, you've gained something from North Korea, on the other hand, you've lost something in Iran. So is the world safer objectively? No. But as it turns out anyway, what he came away with was nothing, wasn't really worth the paper it was written on. Didn't prepare for the meeting, arrived to Singapore a day early, wanted to leave or advance the talks because he was bored. So, he's not a great politician. So, but you still have people saying the great statesman, he's bringing peace to the world. And even though you have all these objective facts, I would say, around you and easily accessible in the media, a lot of people, despite this narrative of a man fixing the world, something that was very illuminating was this. I think it was CNN. It was definitely an American news organization where they went to a town in Texas, and this town voted mostly for Trump. So I think of all towns per capita, this had the highest support for President Trump. It was based on the idea that he would remove the estate tax, which would cripple a lot of farmers. Now, this never really happened because he had this big tax reform that benefited the rich. The estate tax, more or less, is still there, and the people who voted for him because of that, when they're asked about it, they're like, well, I'm sure it'll happen in the future, or or it doesn't matter. They'll just they found another reason to like him just so they could continue liking him. And all the other stuff that they didn't really fit with their narrative, such as the Mueller investigation or Russia, they just blocked it out, and they didn't really want to consider it. So like, I don't know what's happening with Russia. It doesn't affect me. And again, that's kind of like the mystical thing that's happening with politics, I think, in that country, but also generally, because we've mentioned before about Putin and Russia, where like a lot of young people, like all they've known is Putin, and they don't really seem to have like a strong identification with him. But at the same time, they either believe he'll provide something that he can't and vote for him, or they'll vote for him because he addresses something that they are interested in, and the wider context of his presidency, which they might not really agree with. They might not agree with certain attitudes towards the political opposition, for example. They'll just kind of ignore it because, like, it doesn't affect me. Who cares? So, these are the kind of complex issues that are all too common and are really the things that are making the political discourse and the public discourse a lot weaker, and it's not the ability of the left to intellectually argue points of interest. I mean, for example, the immorality of separating kids from their families. I think both sides were able to say how immoral that was, but for a few hardcore supporters, I think they'll continue believing that, building the wall, tough stance on immigration, that's the way forward, and families be damned, so yeah, that's just kind of complex. I mean, this has been happening for a while, in terms of like going back to David Lynch, public figures making statements that are a little bit curious. Germaine Greer's been making a career out of it lately. I think feminism maybe has passed her by, and she wants to kind of keep her profile relevant. I don't know really what her motivations are, but she's saying a lot of things that are a little out of whack. Morrissey, for example, was this mysterious person for such a long time, but now he's coming out with lots of genuinely bizarre statements. Now for Greer, it's probably because I think she wants to keep her star bright. For Morrissey, I just think he's just probably a miserabilist, and he believes the things that he's saying, and unfortunately those things are not nice. Other kind of factors that were kind of influencing me in terms of looking at public figures and the things that they're doing. I mean, Mo Salah, who we've mentioned in previous podcasts as well, at least two anyway. He's been given he's been given honorary citizenship of Chechnya. He got into a lot of trouble as well from some groups because on the first day of Egypt's training camp, which was controversially placed in the Russian Republic of Chechnya, he was like not actually training. He was at a hotel resting and after training, and like he was roused by somebody brought by car to meet the president and had a photo op with him. He's not the first footballer to fall foul of this. I mean, Mussolini, when Italy had the World Cup in 1934, insisted that Italy qualify because normally he insisted they go through the qualification process because normally a host nation qualifies automatically and don't have to go through that process. But he wanted to show how brave and strong and physically pure his footballers were, and he's not the first leader to take a picture with a footballer with a trophy in their hand to get the kind of the associated gloss and sheen for their political benefit. But some people were unhappy with Mo Salah for not saying something. In that particular instance, I don't think he could have done really much. His first day there, he's just been woken up and he's just been kind of placed in this situation. Like I know Mario Balotelli, for example, also got in trouble for getting a photo taken with a known mafioso, but I don't think Balotelli knew who that guy was. It's just like some guy asked him for a photo, and then when it's published, it looks a little bit bad. In terms of like what happened afterwards, I think like a week later they had a state dinner with the entire Egyptian squad, and Mo Salah was the guest of honor. And he didn't really say much. He just kind of looking over at the rest of his teammates during the ceremony, and then he got that honorary citizenship. Like it's a very cynical ploy, obviously, but it's a little bit disappointing because like we're talking about David Lynch saying something perhaps he shouldn't have said, but I'm a little bit disappointed in Mo Salah in not saying anything. Now, because of the controversy, he's allegedly trying to quit, or he's going to quit the Egyptian national team, which he has previous with the Egyptian FA because they've been using his image rights illegally to advertise the Egyptian team. So he's quite unhappy with that. Now, I don't like his personal relationship with the FA of his country. I don't know so much about that apart from the examples I've just mentioned. But like Chechnya has a pretty patchy record in terms of like minority rights and treating the political opposition with respect. Even with the Nemtsov murder in Russia, there's allegedly links between Chechens, the killers being from Chechnya and under the command of their president. That's never been proven, and obviously I can't say either way if that's true or not. That's the legal disclaimer. But it's like it's a very dirty business there anyway in the Russian Republic. So you kind of would like to have a footballer to have the moral courage to kind of say, hey, I don't want a photograph, or I was mistaken to be involved with that, and now that I've learned more, I hold my hands up and I decry the situations that are happening in that country, or something to that effect. Because like Seth Rogen, for example, was on a previous or a recent episode of the Stephen Colbert Show, and Paul Ryan from Trump's government wanted a photograph with him because his kids were fans, and obviously Seth Rogen took pics with the kids, but like he refused to take a pic with Ryan because he didn't really agree with his politics, and that wasn't done publicly or whatever. It was just done at this event, and he stuck by his convictions, and you have to say fair enough. Well, sometimes I think footballers have a genuine platform to be more vocal about issues, and a lot of footballers do a lot of good work. Apparently, Luka Modric has done great work in his country, and you have other examples as well. But in terms of being vocally political, sometimes you just want more leadership, maybe, or more moral leadership from these players. So that's kind of one aspect of it. The last thing I'll talk about is just Ingmar Bergman. I think he's an interesting character. Like, I love his movie The Seventh Seal for a lot of reasons. I think also the closing scene where he has the actors running with Death over the hill is such an iconic shot of cinema, and I think it's just so beautiful. And I really like it as well because not only is it like just visually delightful, to use a word I don't use that often. It's also like just how great things happen, sometimes just through circumstance, because I think you just saw the lighting and said, hey, let's just get this shot, and the actors weren't even there. I think you just dressed up some of the crew, got that shot very quickly, and it became like a very fitting finale for a beautiful movie and very interesting movie. Now, I like Bergman as well because I think some of the things that happened in his life are relevant to our discussion of the second part of part two, in terms of like he was a fascist when he was younger because Sweden had a neutral policy in World War II, but it was a neutrality that was very pro-German. Like Ireland was neutral in the war as well, but had a policy that was very pro-Allied. So he grew up being a Nazi, but then he renounced that, and I think he felt very shamed by that. So he decided not to make political movies. Instead, he made human movies and existential movies, in terms of like, like does God exist, things like that, and decided to stay away from politics. I think which I think is interesting because like I've never really gotten into Simone de Beauvoir or Paul Sartre because I kind of knew that they were also a bit on the collaborative side with the Nazis during World War II. I always kind of felt, perhaps wrongly, that their policy of existentialism and bleakness and nothing really matters was just a kind of justification after the fact of their support of the Nazis. But then again, I could be being too harsh because I think, if you want to square who you are with a person with your previous behavior, if your previous behavior is like, well, I was a Nazi, that can be very traumatic to do. So, maybe I should cut both them and Bergman some slack because it's a very difficult thing to accept about yourself. So who knows? But a lot of things in his movies as well, but identity, like kind of like David Lynch has done this as well a little bit, where you have two characters that kind of fall in love with each other because they have things that both of them are lacking. Which and then they kind of merge, so their identities like merge. It's more than romance. It's more than the physical thing. It's kind of like a blending of two personalities, and it has a tragic outcome. Basically, it's not like a good process. And I think that's kind of what's happening as well today with politics, because you have people that feel so disenfranchised, and for a lot of time for very legitimate reasons, and they see someone like Trump, and they see like someone that they who kind of fulfills them, who is them, understands them, who loves them, and they love him because he loves them, and they kind of complete each other in a toxic way. And I think the toxic results that we see in the Bergman movies and the Lynch movies is playing out and will continue playing out until this blending of ideas and identities becomes like unblended, unmixed. Because as it is now, I think people are so invested in movements like Trump that an attack on him is an attack on them, and they feel so represented by what he represents, and they need that, I think, for their self-esteem or for their lives. So I think his movies teach us, I think, a little bit about politics and about human nature as well. An interesting thing about Bergman as well is that he wasn't very popular in his native Sweden, because he kind of played the role of the morose Swede that fitted into the stereotype of Sweden that Europeans had because of the weather. Perhaps they were, a bit more, yeah, as I said, morose. They're a bit like drier, bleaker. And a lot of Swedes didn't think, hey, we produced ABBA. ABBA are fun. We're fun. Leave us alone. So they felt like that he didn't really compliment how they saw themselves, for example. So again, that's only a loose thing at the end of the podcast of part 2, because I don't think it's kind of interesting. I guess it kind of fits in as well with like the ideas of identity and how we see ourselves, because maybe that's a theme that's been running through this part 2, but from how we see ourselves through our work, like I was describing the classes, how through our voice, like with a story, how we see our species through music, and how we see ourselves through footballers if you're a kind of Chechen strongman, or how we see ourselves through our political leaders, or maybe perhaps in our opposition to them, and sometimes as well how we see ourselves through the people that we like. So maybe you're a David Lynch fan or a Morrissey fan, and you feel let down by the things that they say, or maybe you don't. So I guess that is the unifying theory of this kind of mess of a meandering, tangent-heavy episode. So yeah, that's all I can say today. So join me for part 3, and as promised, the wonderful Mary will be back on next week's episode. So that was part 2, and here we are in part 3. You can find us on alarpamedia.com, which is our website, alarpa1 on Twitter, alarpa on Instagram, and alarpa media is our YouTube handle, and also our Patreon handle if you want to contribute a little bit to the ongoing process. But of course, if not, don't worry about it. This content and all other content shall be coming to you free regardless. So we'll be giving you more news as we go along of our audio guide, so should you find yourself in Madrid, you can download that, or you will be able to download that very shortly and enjoy the sights of Madrid with our insights behind it. So, not much to say apart from that. Enjoy the Mundial/World Cup, your weekends, your following weeks, and we'll be talking to you next Thursday, more than likely, with definitely an episode dropping next week. And as I mentioned in part 1, the dynamic duo of the Alarpa podcast will be back together, and we'll be discussing the great topics of the week together. So have fun, talk to you later, and we'll see you then.